Right, hello and welcome. This is an economics A2 video for chapter 3. Sorry, I've dropped this pen about 5 times. Not the best start. Anyway, this is the start of chapter 3 of F583, and we're looking at the labour side of the course in this video. Now, this video is about labour market failure. I'm going to give a bit of an insight into what that is, a couple of things that causes that. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I don't want to make this video several hours long, so I'm just going to sort of kick it off a little bit in this video and mention that labour market failure and how that occurs. And anyway, so that's a small part of the video. It's about as long as I've been rambling on about that, so it's quite quick. The long part of the video we'll be looking at what a monopsonist is, and we'll be looking at perfect competition, trade union. Well, we've already looked at perfect competition in leisure markets, in the leisure market section of the video. But as I said, so hopefully you understand that already. So that's where I'm assuming you're at. Then I'm going to be looking at explain a bit about trade unions and trade unions on effects of monopolists and markets of perfect competition. So let's kick off straight away. Now, best thing to do when we examine, first of all, I'm going to talk about labour market failure. Now we need to think back to our F581 topic of market failure. Now they are quite similar, because when we look at the market for a labour, so when we were looking at wage rates, we did something like this. We had standard supply and demand diagram, something like that. And it was very much like your F581, and that was said was the supply of labour and the demand of labour. So it looks something like that, obviously, you know, with your price and your quantity of demand and supplies of labour, etc. So we had something like that. So when, say if that we ignored these and we just said that was just simply demand and that was just simply supply of a good. And then we said, you know, the price was P and the quantity demanded was Q and supply. So that's what we said for F581. We said that was basically equilibrium. Now, for market failure, we said, we're using this concept, we said market failure occurs each and every time a market without any government intervention, so a market with something such as this, fails to lead to the best or optimum use of scarce resources. So how do we apply that into the labour context? So when we say supply of labour and demand of labour, how do we apply that concept to labour? Now, we need to think about that last little bit, the allocation of resources. Now, when we're talking about labour, we're only talking about one resource, labour. So, basically, if we reset that again, all we've done is said is just put this resource of labour, that's all we're discussing when we discuss the labour market. And we said the market failure occurs each and every time a market without any government intervention. We don't need to worry about that a little bit. Anyway, so without government fails to lead to the best or optimum use of labour, not scarce resources, because we're talking about the labour market in this context. So that's, I mean, it's quite obvious really. So anyway, what does that actually mean? That's just a load of words that I've just said there. How do we put that into some kind of context that humans can understand? So there's a couple of things that basically there's two main areas that we look at when we talk about this. We talk about labour market shortages and labour market excess. So that what I drew before, I thought my mind was going then. That was equilibrium. That was good. So we know that's equilibrium. Good. Supply and demand, very happy. They intersect each other. We get a price. We get a quantity demanded. Good. There's no waste of anything. So there's no market failure. There'd be market failure if we had something like this. So we're going to draw our supply and demand diagram again, but I'm not going to draw the price level where demand and supply intersect. I'm just going to draw a price level above that, so we'll call that P. I'm going to draw a price level below the equilibrium, I'm going to call that P1. And I'm not going to draw the quantities, but the main key of this was where they're on the bottom. We had where if you drew the price level and drew it to demand, there'd be a high level of demand and low level of supply because it's a very low price. So therefore we said there was excess demand. And if you remember, we said when the price is too high, we are going to have excess. Oh, that hasn't gone well. We're going to have excess supply. Yes, if you remember that diagram from F581, it was something like that. Now, if we relate that diagram to the topic that we're currently looking at, which is in terms of labour, then obviously this was demand of labour and supply of labour, because we're looking at the labour market, don't forget. So this isn't just excess demand of anything, of any good, an excess supply of any good. We're actually looking at this in the context of labour. So it's excess demand of labour, excess supply of labour. And if the excess supply and the excess demand in them 2 points, there was market failure in F581 because the resources weren't being allocated in the right sense, then we can use this context to look at the labour market failure. If we apply this concept, so we talk about this diagram on the board, we say, well, at higher prices and there's not enough allocation of resources, there's not enough allocation of, there's too much allocation of labour and not enough demand, that we've got excess supply of labour, or excess of labour, just an excess capacity of labour. But what we've got here is such a low wage rate, these prices in the labour market, we don't call them prices, we call them, because it's essentially the price of labour, which is the wage rate. So at low wage rates, we have excess demand of labour. Remember, not just excess demand. So therefore, we have too much being demanded of labour than the people are willing to supply. So therefore, we have a labour, something we know as a labour shortage. Basically, we just don't have enough of it. That's fairly simple to understand. So we have a labour shortage at low wage rates, which hopefully should be quite self-explanatory from what we've just been drawing there. So, as I said, hopefully that's been. It's just we're not using anything too strenuous there. We're just going off our F581 knowledge, really. So hopefully that's been some kind of help to understand labour market failure, because we're not allocating the right amount of labour at given wage rates. But hopefully, as I said, nothing too. All we're just using is the concept of labour as being the good in that. So I've sort of tried to explain that in the context of something you would already know. So anyway, that's labour market failure done. What we're going to talk about now is we're going to introduce the idea of a monopolist. So you say, isn't it? Monopsonist, sorry. So what is a monopsonist? Well, if you look at the word monopsonist, if I can spell it right. So monopsonist. Now that's why I was kind of about to say the word. It's very close to the word monopoly, which is used in the leisure side of the course. So we already know, if we know what a monopoly is, which is, if we always use a concept when we're talking about monopolies, in the case of a pure monopoly, where we have one firm in the market and dominates it, and then we get, for a monopoly, so before we talk about monopsonist, if we have just recap on monopoly for a second, the diagram for monopoly, I mean, this is quite irrelevant, but just to get your mind back into it, really. When we had the diagram for monopoly, we had two diagrams. If you remember, the monopoly was there's the firm, and there's also the market, because there's only one firm in the market, so it's a market. And then there was one diagram for the short one and long one as well, because we said the abnormal profit is does not change. So we had something like where we had the demand and the marginal revenue, the average revenue, and we had something like this where so that was just one of the diagrams, so a variation of diagrams for the monopoly market. But I'm trying to keep it simple, so if we had something like that, that was when we were demonstrating the deadweight welfare loss for that one. And we said profit maximisation occurs here, and they actually only charge this price here, and we went off from that. So I tried to help you understand where we're going to come from this diagram, because I didn't want to draw the full monopoly diagram, you know, the average total cost curve and the short run. The marginal cost curve, because I need to relate it to what we're about to do. So if you keep that diagram in your mind, I'm going to rub that off because I don't really want to keep it on, it just confuse you if I had it both next to each other. But, you know, this is a key thing to keep in your mind. Okay, so if that was what a monopoly is, it's a one firm in the market, then a monopsonist has to be something along them lines, surely. Because it wouldn't just call a monopsonist, something with a billion firms in the market, otherwise it'd call it a perfectionist. Just let me. It didn't work that way. Anyway, so if we apply the concept of one firm in the market to the monopsonist, so the monopsonist is a fancy way of saying it's the monopoly, but instead of it being the firm selling a good, we're talking about the labour side of the market, don't forget. So we're looking at it in terms of labour, so buying labour. So therefore, the monopsonist is a firm, there's one, where there is one firm buying the labour. So the monopsonist, I can't even spell it, this is winding me up, monopsonist. So we said that was where there was one firm buying the labour. An example of this could be the NHS, the government health service. Good. So anyway, there you go, that's an example there. So if we use, I told you to think about that diagram for the monopolist, where there was the deadweight welfare loss. That's irrelevant, but the diagram is fairly similar to the one we're about to draw. Now, in that one, we were looking at the supply as being in terms of the marginal cost. However, we're going to look at it in the average cost as well. So if we draw a standard diagram here, so if we draw the demand curve going down, because we're looking at, so this is demand of labour. Now, for a supply of labour for a monopsonist, we're quite it's going to be the upside down. It's going to be the inverted version of the deadweight welfare loss diagram. If that makes sense to you. If it doesn't, then don't worry, because that's just the way I think of it. Because in the monopoly market diagram for the deadweight welfare loss, we have two downward sloping curves and one upward sloping curve for supply. In this, we'll have two upward sloping curves for supply. Well, they don't both mean supply, but anyway, yeah. The average cost still means supply, but we're going to add another upward sloping cost curve on there. And I'll explain why in a minute. So if we just draw the diagram. So you get your average cost on the lower one, and then your marginal cost. Fairly same sort of thing. We have the marginal cost. So as you see, it's sort of the inverted version of the one we've just drawn. That's why I told you to keep it in your mind. Now, obviously this demand of labour is equal to the marginal revenue. That's a key bit. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Obviously you have your quantity and your price, but I've not drawn them on just so I can explain the diagram a bit better. Now, that's very well and good, but why do we have a marginal cost curve that is above our average cost curve? That is one of the key things about this diagram. Now, the best way to think of it, or the only way to think of this, is if we want to increase our quantity sold, if we want to increase Q, then the only way of doing that is by hiring more workers. Or basically, if you hire to hire more workers, you have to increase the price or the wage rate. Now, if you increase the wage rate of the new worker, you also therefore have to increase the wage rate of the other workers that are already in the organisation. Otherwise, they'll start complaining, why is he getting a higher wage than me for doing exactly the same job? You don't just, if you suddenly increase the wage rate and all the other workers are running lower wage rate, they'll go, what? I'm doing the same job. Why are you paying them a higher wage rate? And they'll just punk off and leave and find a company that does that. So anyway, that's what it is. So that's why we've got a marginal cost curve, because a marginal cost, remember, is the cost of producing the next unit. However, we're not talking about just producing goods now, we're talking about labour. So it's the cost of the next unit of labour. and as that's why it sort of increases a bit more, because the cost of producing the next unit of labour, you're not just singularly increasing the cost of that one person, increasing the cost of all the other people. So therefore each cost, so your overall labour costs are going to be higher, so the change in labour costs will be greater. So therefore that's why, anyway, I'm confusing you. Basically, just think about it is, you've got to add the cost in of the current worker you're increasing the pay rise for to get that worker in, and then you've got to increase the pay of all the other people to keep them happy. So it's like a double increase on the curve. That's why it's like double the gradient of the average cost. So anyway, hopefully that makes some kind of sense. Right. Now, as it's a monopsonist, they are very similar to Monopoly, where they are profit maximisers. And we said profit maximisation, so I'll put PM, don't get this confused with the idiots in politics, means profit maximisation. That occurs where MC equals MR, or the marginal cost curve, intersects the marginal revenue or marginal revenue product curve, which is that demand curve there. So, therefore, marginal cost equals marginal revenue down here. So, this is the point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. However, this is not the supply curve, this is the supply curve. So we have to draw a little dotted line down to the supply curve, and then line across from that point, and we get a wage rate. We're going to call that W. Okay, and then if we continue the line down, so that was a wage rate, we say, okay, right, well, what is the quantity then? Quantity is Q. Now, if we look at this from a perfect competition perspective, a perfect competition occurs because we are essentially, a market perfect competition is where supply equals demand. Now, that is where the equilibrium position would normally be. Now, the equilibrium position, supply equals demand, which is here. So this is in a market, this is market perfect competition. I'm going to combine the diagrams here. But this is a diagram you draw for Monopsonist, sorry. And that gets us a wage rate we're going to call W1. However, if we look at our original point of the marginal cost curve, so if the monopolist should be, because this is how much they're adding to their total revenue, they would, so basically, where marginal cost intersects marginal revenue, that's the revenue that the firm is bringing in from each unit they're selling, but they're only paying the worker a wage rate, which is where the line down for the marginal cost curve intersects the supply curve, which is at W, but they are actually receiving a price for the good equal to W2. So therefore, the distance between W2 minus W, so this price level here minus this price level, thinking of the wage rate, remember, is equal to the exploitation of the worker. Okay, so hopefully that makes some kind of sense. So as we said, that we explained why the marginal cost curve was higher than the average cost curve, because to increase the amount of workers you've got to pay more, and if you pay more to one worker, you've got to pay more to all the workers that you have in the firm. So that's why the marginal cost curve is above. And then we said normally you'd have where supply equals demand, that is your inter-equilibrium. You draw a price level across from that, which is W1, and I'm saying because that's the wage rate, we call it W, not P1, and that corresponds with the quantity Q1 of workers. However, because we're considered with a monopsonist, they are profit maximisers, and that occurs where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, and that occurs at that point there, and because that is not the supply curve, we have to draw a line down to the supply curve, which gets us a wage rate W and a quantity Q. So that's how much the workers are being paid, but they're bringing in W2 worth of revenue. So they'll be ripped off from W1 to W2. Now you could put labels on here. If you wanted to, when you're doing your diagram, you could just put A, B and C, or A, C and B, whatever you want to put. It's up to you. Just make sure you're able to distinguish. That's the equilibrium free a perfect competition. That's the equilibrium for a monopsonist. But because that is not the supply curve, you have to draw a line down to C, which gets you your wage rate, W, that's the amount you pay the workers. So they're actually, Monopsonists actually getting away with only paying them W, when really you should be paying them W too. So obviously they're being ripped off. So who's going to step in? Because obviously this can't be allowed from the worker. The worker, assuming they know this, the worker's going to be very happy. They're going to want to do something about this. Which leads me very nicely onto something called trade unions. Now, a big part of this, you would have seen them in the 1980s. If you were around then, well, assuming you're watching this video, you weren't. Because you wouldn't be watching this video for any other reason. So, back in the 1980s, when they were carving fossils out of stone, when dinosaurs were around, my old Margaret Thatcher was involved, and she believed the best thing to do was to reduce the power of trade unions so that it could increase aggregate supply. Now, so that was just a bit of background, but what actually is a trade union? A trade union is a collection of, I won't go, change my mind. I won't go straight into it. So, if you were a worker and you just went up to a firm and said, I've had enough of this W wage rate, I want to be paid W2, because I know, very clever, that I should be paying W2 because that's what you're earning. But the Monopsonist goes, you're one pathetic little insignificant speck on my floor of employees. But, if all of them came and said, alright, we're all very skilled, this isn't acceptable, we want a higher wage rate, then, yeah, that'd be very good. But the more people you have in this, the more powerful it is. And obviously, the more skilled it is, etc. So they're just anyway, so the union is a collection of workers from the organisation that would, that represent the workers and try and improve working conditions or increase their pay. Now, that idea of having more workers makes them more powerful is a term that we know for collective bargaining. It's just a fancy word, a way of saying they get more power and they're able to make more decisions. Now, another thing about trade unions, but just for I apply it to this diagram, trade unions are quite powerful, but their power is determined, and the power of the Monopsonist is determined in various ways. So, if the trade union has very high power, and the Monopsonist has very low power, this could be due to a number of factors, such as the not being many workers to switch between. So if the workers say, "Oh, we're not very happy with this pay," there's not another worker, loads of other workers that are going to accept. It's going to be very hard for the monopolist to say no. However, if there isn't many workers, but there's a lot of capital, and it's very easy to switch between, hence low skilled workers, then you can easily switch between, and the wage rate won't be changed. Just a few other things as well. Sorry. Yeah. So the more workers involved, the more powerful it is, because if there's only one worker involved in the union, and the union wants to strike, then only one worker will be striking, which won't be very disruptive. Which leads me on to another feature about unions. A union will be more powerful if the sorry, just lost my train of thought there. Yeah, so that was it. So a worker, the union, will be more powerful if the disruption caused is going to be a lot greater. Because we've got to think the monopsonist or monopsonist in this case won't just mess about and go, oh yeah, because we're kind people, we are going to give you a wage rise. Because he's asked for it, we'll give it you, don't worry. All they're bothered about is profit maximisation, as we said before. Now they have to weigh up which is more costly to them. Simply giving these workers a pay rise and avoiding them going out on strike, or not giving them a pay rise and saying, go out on strike, doesn't bother us, we'll get more money from you going out on strike than giving you a higher wage, and we'll find someone else in the meantime, slack off. They have to balance that decision. Now obviously it works the other way around, so if they for all the features that I've said, so if there's loads of other people that they can switch, then the monopsonist has more power. If the capital is easier to switch between, then the monopsonist has more power. So it works both ways. Recently, the power has been taken away from the trade unions and given to the monopsonist. So this has been in terms of laws, so they've been reducing laws for trade unions, and various other things have happened along the way, but you don't need to know too much about that unless you research in a specific industry, which I won't go into in this part of the video. So anyway, that's monopsonist. So how does the trade union, I'm going to say choose then, well, I'm thinking, how does the trade union affect this? Now we said prices are increased by trade unions, prices, wages, sorry. Now what we want to get close to is this W1. Well, which is actually the maximum the trade union could ever push for is this wage rate, W2, sorry. Because that is where, that's the amount of cash the monopolist is bringing in for each thing selling, and they wouldn't pay a worker more than they would bring in, because that's like, oh, we'll just give you £5, we just throw it away, we don't need this money. Well, as we said, monopsonist and monopolist for that matter, but monopolists in this case are profit maximisers. So they're not going to make a loss. They're not going to make a decision that will cause them to make a loss. So they're not going to make a wage rate that's W2. So if the wage rate that the trade union increases, if it's closer to W2 than W1, so in other words, if it increases, then the trade union has more power. But if the wage is reduced, or is closer, sorry, to W than W2, then the monopolist has more power. So you could have a go if you wanted at drawing different wages. Now one key thing, before I go on, when they increase after W1, the wage rate doesn't continue to go up the supply curve. It actually goes backwards. Actually goes back along the demand curve, because remember, we're constrained by the demand curve, not the supply curve. So it actually goes back towards your A point. So what will actually happen? So when the trade union increases the wage rate after W1, they will actually start to lose workers, but they will have gained workers, and they will never lose workers in a monopsony. So if they increase the wage rate, they will never lose more than they originally had. Because, as we said, when they increase it, they won't get past W2, no matter what they try, they won't get past it. You know, if they threaten monopsonists with death, then they probably won't get past W2. If they get somewhere close, they'll probably get W 1.997 or something like that. Anyway, so that was just a bit of, I tried to be funny. So that's just an example of how a trade union would affect a monopolist. It's very much, so that's, as I said, hopefully that's been understandable. Let's just rub it off, give me a second. Right, just rub it off. So we're going to look at perfect competition now for trade unions. So that was all of what a monopsonist is. So we said monopsonist, if you remember, just recap it, was one firm that buys labour and is the sort of, it's got the diagram which is the inverse of the monopoly for deadweight welfare loss. We have two costs going up. You have the average cost and your marginal cost. Your marginal cost is above, because when you increase the increase the supply of workers, you have to pay all of them a higher wage, not just the ones you're taking on, with a standard downward sloping demand curve. So as I said, hopefully that makes some kind of sense. Alright, so that's what a monopsonist was, and then we said a profit maximisers, which is where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, and that point occurred, and we drew the line down to meet the average cost curve or the supply curve, and then we got a wage rate. If you remember, I called it W, when they should have been charging the wage rate W3, which is where the line across from the marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Yeah, but in the perfect competition, we said they charge where supply is equal to demand, and that's W2. Now we're just really going to go off that W2. So I'm just going to draw where I said, oh, this is where it occurs. Well, a perfect competition market. So perfect competition markets, remember, they don't exist, but or a good benchmark. Okay, so I'm just going to call this wage rate W2 because that's what I called it, and to help you see where we got it from in the previous video. Now, there's a couple of things the trade union can do in a market of perfect competition. Again, they don't exist, but hypothetically, what they could do a number of things. They could either increase the supply by, decrease the supply, to increase the rate, and they could do that by raising the qualifications. But if we increase supply, if we just draw the diagram on, that's one, it's not quite extreme enough, but never mind. Cut to be 3, then we end up, it's clear enough I think, we end up reducing quantity supplied, so we actually lose work because we end up with people not in, the market still clears but people aren't, it's not really good, people can't get into this market. So essentially there are people that want to get into the market but they can't because they don't have the skills, so we don't call them unemployed. Halfway between the two extremes of having shifting the supply and shifting the demand curve would just be simply increasing the wage rate, and this would be they can just simply increase the wage rate because if their work is very skilled, then they could just simply ask for a higher wage rate, and the perfect competition probably would apply for that. So anyway, we said this was W2. Quantity demanded Q2. I'm only calling it Q2, not Q, and W2, not W, just because we talked about it in that sense in the Monopsonist. So anyway, that's what standard equilibrium would look like. And then if we said, okay, right, so they just simply increase the wage rate to W3. We've got two quantities there, so it's obviously going to be excess of something. So what we have is when we said the excess supply of labour, because these are demand and supply of labour, it's what we drew at the start, then we've got excess supply. So the excess supply, so there's the labour extensions, there's too much labour in the market, which is what we talked about at the start of the video, which I just realised I didn't need to draw that. So anyway, that was if the wages just increase the wage in the market, perfect competition. It'd be stupid because you'd have unemployed people in the market, people who want the job, have the skills, want the wage rate, but they can't because there's no point in employing them. They don't want to be. Perfect competition doesn't want to employ them. Okay, so that's why that one is. Now, the other thing the trade union can do is have a word with the perfect competition, the firm in the market perfect competition, and say, look, if we get our workers and train them up for you, which would be good for the firm because then they'd have to spend money on training them. Obviously which is beneficial for them for obvious reasons, and then they say, okay, so these trained workers will have a higher productivity, and if they have a higher productivity, then the demand for the workers is going to be increased. So we call this again W2, Q2, as I explained before. Just keep within the diagram. So the increased productivity would lead to a shifted demand curve, such as the one on the board, T1. Therefore we'd have a new equilibrium. Obviously I haven't labelled these equilibriums because I'm lazy, but you would. So like A and B and whatnot. So then you had a wage rate W3 and Q3. So this is great. This is the best situation for a trade union to do because not only have they increased the wage rate is increased, they've also increased the number of people employed, which is great for both the firm because they've got more people employed and the workers because they've got a higher wage rate, which means the trade union, that's a perfect thing for a trade union to do in a market perfect competition. Perfect. So anyway, so there's three situations we've just gone through for perfect competition for trade unions, which was where they shift the demand curve, supply curve, which is due to them increasing qualifications. So we're saying to the worker, the firm, right, this job, the people in it too stupid, need to raise qualifications, which obviously wouldn't happen to say something a bit nicer than that, but that's the essence of it. And obviously that would shift the supply because the left, reduce the supply because less people have the qualifications in order to do the job. So if less people have the qualifications, then supply shifts to the left and that increases prices, or in this case increases the wage rate. However, they just simply asked for an increase in wage rate. Said, okay, we're not going to mess around with supply. We just say to them, look, increase your wages. Then the firm would go, yeah, we'll increase your wages, but because the people are still exactly the same, we assume, it's going to be more costly. They're going to have greater cost per unit. So the only way they're going to survive and keep profits is by reducing back to the equilibrium because they've got excess supply of labour. So that's why that one was. And then we said about the... Sorry, my brain has just gone recently. So anyway, we said about where there's increased productivity of workers. So when the trade unions work with the firms and say, look, we've got objectives here. If we increase the productivity of our workers and you increase the wage rate, we'll all be happy. So the demand curve increases, the wage rate increases, and the quantity supplied. It's basically more people are in work, so it's all bonus there. So that's everything pretty much on this topic. Yep. So that's covered trade unions and monopsonists and labour market failure. The next video we're going to go on to will just be about imperfect information and unemployment and economic inactivity, which is fairly familiar from last year's work. So as I said, hopefully that's been worth you watching it. Sorry, I've been a little rusty on some of the topics. If you want me to, I'll quite happily do another video, but hopefully with a small time I have remaining, this will be sufficient. Any other questions, if you want me to add some questions onto the side of this video, please don't be afraid to drop us a message, and I'll try and do a video with questions as soon as I can. Also, I'm currently at work, hopefully by the time this video is out, I'll have made a revision guide for F583 and I won't have done F585 by the time the exam comes around, because I haven't started up yet. And will have done C3 revision guide, C4 revision guide, and a physics A2 revision guide. So if any of them apply to you, please get in touch with me, and I'll try and arrange, pop you one over on the internet. So thanks for watching that, and as I said, we'll get working on that in the next video. So we'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching, and well done for surviving it. See you in the next video.